Hi everyone and welcome along to Sonic Academy with me, Chris. Today I'm joined by a producer whose tracks have appeared on the likes of Mousetrap, Wartone and Global Underground. His music has also been played with the likes of Pete Tong, Deadmau5 and James Abilia. He's held residencies in clubs that you may have heard called Ministry of Sound and Space in Ibiza. And his sound design work has appeared on content for FXpansion, Xfer, Force and even factory content for Moog. Would you please welcome to Sonic Academy the one, the only Dom Kane. Hi Dom, you there?
Hi mate, how's it going?
It's going very well, thank you very much for joining us today on Sonic Academy. For those that don't know, you are one of the rising stars on the Mousetrap label with your appearances on the last couple of We Are Friends compilations. How did that all come about?
So yeah, it's a bit of a long-winded story. About 4 years ago, I'd sort of just got annoyed with the industry and where it was going. There seemed to be only two channels, certainly in the UK. Mm-hmm. There seemed to be only sort of two channels that you could go, and one was the whole sort of EDM thing, which was electro at the time. And then basically every sort of style of house just merged into what we now know as deep house, which isn't deep at all. And I didn't like either of them, and I didn't want to sort of follow those paths. They didn't interest me as a producer, and perhaps more importantly as a nerd. You know, I like to sort of experiment with different synths and different sounds and different melodies and different ideas. And I found that both of those genres sort of just were cut and paste and very formulaic, and there was no room for experimentation in there. And it just didn't interest me. So I ended up deciding, okay, I'm not going to be an artist, but I can carry on with my sound design, my engineering, my studio work. And so I sort of focused on setting up my studio and getting all that up and running. And then while I was doing some sound design for Moog for the Sub 37, I just kind of made a few sounds that just tickled something inside me, I guess. And I sort of thought, so at this point I probably hadn't produced for myself for probably 2 years, and just something happened inside me, and I thought, oh, I like this. And started sort of developing a track and thought, I like where this is going, and it was just purely for my own enjoyment. And I think it's very easy as a producer to get caught up in the industry and start following and perhaps forgetting why you even got into it in the first place. And this was my sort of my rekindling of all of that, and realization of actually, yeah, this is why I do it. It's because I enjoy making weird new sounds and piecing them together. And yeah, so I did that, and I ended up sending a few of them to a mate of mine, Sonny, who runs Wartone Records, and he snapped them up instantly. He said, right, I need this. This is exactly where we want to be going, and I feel like this is where the music scene is bubbling in the underground at the moment. So I thought, yeah, all right, have them. You know, it was either that or just let them sit on my computer. And yeah, and they did very well. I think they all went top 40 on TrackSource, and they did very well. They were well received, and I just sort of ignored all of that and just carried on doing what I was doing. Sent another one to Sonny a few months later. And he turned around and said, "No, I think this is too big for us. You know, we're only limited in what we can do as a label. I think you're going to need to go to someone bigger." So I happened to, you know, because I knew Deadmau5 and people from the Mousetrap label already, I thought, okay, well, I'll give them a go because it's got that kind of vibe to it. And yeah, and they snapped it up, and then wanted more, and still carry on wanting more. So it's
nice. Can you tell us a bit about how you first met Joel and how that relationship's developed?
Yeah, so I again, it was all sort of more luck than judgment. it was quite a while before he had actually become famous as deadmau5. And a mate of mine, Jody Wistonoff from way out west, phoned me up one day because I was resident in Ministry of Sound and I was living in London at the time. And he phoned me up out of the blue saying, look, I've got a mate, Joel, who's come from Canada. It's his first UK gig. They've just dumped him in a hotel in London. Is there any chance you can go down and just keep him company for a few hours? So I thought, yeah, why not? So I went down to meet him, and we got talking, and everything was great. And he showed me a few of his tracks, and one of those tracks happened to be the draft, or the final draft version of Faxing Berlin. And I remember just it blowing me away at that moment, and me thinking, wow, this guy's good. This guy's doing something that no one else has done. And it was weird because at the time he was really just using, I guess, trance narratives in music, but at progressive house speeds. It's just something that was a kind of combination that I hadn't heard before. And yeah, I guess the rest is history, really.
I think it's an important lesson for anybody watching, anybody starting out. You know, those relationships there, you met a young guy randomly, first gig in the UK, you go down and meet him, and he turns out to be one of the biggest producers in the world, and very successful and stuff. And because you've built that relationship, you're now working on his label, and you know, you've got a relationship there. And it's very important for young guys out there to realize networking and meeting people and stuff, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. I mean, you know, I've always sort of said to new producers who seem to happily sometimes sit there and slag off other producers, and I think, well, actually that producer you're slagging off right now could be your stepping stone in the future. You know, you don't know where things are going to go. I've been fortunate enough that I've watched many of my friends sort of climb the ranks and do incredibly well. And you know, I've never purposefully placed myself around them. I've just supported friends who I think are fantastic producers, and they've deservedly, you know, climbed up the ranks. So I think it's very important that we as producers sort of work together in that, and support each other through that, because you don't know when it's your turn or if it's ever going to be your turn. But I think it's vital to sort of hold those relationships, particularly with the nice people. And I've sort of, that's another piece of advice, I guess, is that something I've learned in hindsight is, if I do think another producer is an idiot, I just don't associate myself with that person, but I also won't sit there and slag them off and say bad things, because, well, first of all, it doesn't benefit anyone. It sure as hell doesn't benefit me. But I've been fortunate enough that I've met some really, really nice people in the industry. You know, like I said about Sonny, you know, Sonny I knew, again, since far before he was famous and far before I'd had any real career. And we've been pretty much best friends since. And so when it came to me having that sort of musical epiphany moment, he was the first person I sent some tracks to, because he was a mate, not because he ran Wartone and therefore he could do me a favour. It was because he was one of my best mates, and I think that was the vital part to it, because then he was able to offer me support and give me honest feedback.
Cool. What's it like to be on a label like Mousetrap? You know, they're not the atypical sort of label creatively and stuff, are they?
Yeah, not at all. It's quite a scary thing at times, and but I mean that in a very positive way. They really support and embrace new creative directions, and that I think has come at a right time in my life for me. Where I like to experiment, I like to push some new things, and in fact I've just done an EP for them, where a couple of the tracks are really, I mean, they're very much me, they're very much my sound, but they're really pushing into a genre that doesn't exist, I suppose. And those tracks are probably the favourites of the EP for Mousetrap, because they want to be different, and I think they want to be known as different. And they're a business, they're a commercial entity, as should any record label be to an extent. But they really do like to see their artists push new boundaries. They don't want to hear just the same thing over and over again. Everything needs to be tweaked a little bit and pushed to new levels. And I think a good example of where it gets scary with them is they were thinking about doing an end of year compilation the end of last year, and they sort of approached all the Mousetrap artists basically saying, can you send us something a little bit different? It can be an edit or a remix of one of our other artists' tracks or one of your own, but we just want it to be something a bit different. It's up to you on what you do. And that was basically the brief. So there was no, we need 128 BPM, it needs to be this sound or this direction. And I think most labels, I find these days, are looking for that, that Beatport top 10 or whatever it is they want. Whereas Mousetrap, they kind of assume or hope that the sales will follow, I guess. Yeah. The sales is a secondary thought to the music.
But isn't it quite? It's quite, because I believe that the Beatport top 10 is becoming less and less important to people, and listening to stuff is becoming more and more important, like Spotify and discovering your own niche within Spotify. You go and listen to We Are Your Friends, and Mousetrap are signing some really interesting artists. We've had Draft on for an interview last month, No Mana, Atlas. They're all doing really creative, and Matt Lange we've had on 18 months ago. Matt did an EP, or maybe an album or an EP last year, and sonically it was just incredible. It was one of the best things I'd heard in a long time. So does it up your game being surrounded and being sort of pushed that hard?
Yeah, well that's where it gets scary as well. I have to admit, there are times where I might have just signed a new track to Mousetrap, and then I'll see their following couple of releases, and I just think, wow, why have they signed me? What made them take my track? Because as far as I can tell, my tracks are just subpar compared to these guys, which is something that scares me, but equally sort of elates me, I suppose. And it's I think that's what makes Mousetrap such a special label to work for, is the other artists on there. They just seem to invent new things all the time, and that's really what I think a good record label should be about, because they manage to carry their own distinct sound, but at the same time they're constantly developing that sound, and I think it's they seem to pick and choose the artists who are going to work well together, and I think that's kind of key to it all, really, is that as a Mousetrap artist, I don't think any two of us sound identical.
No.
But whenever we chat and swap music and work with each other and support each other, which we do as a sort of quite a close unit, we all seem to be thinking on the same levels, and I think that's quite key to it all, really, is there's a lot of collaborative support in there.
That sounds amazing. That sounds really cool. Let's talk about, let's start and get into specifics about tracks, like Low Pass Friends. It sounds to me very much out of the box. It sounds like Moogs and stuff to me. Am I correct? It's not in the box. And what sort of, I'm particularly interested in that really sour ARP, that sort of wavering ARP. What made that?
Yeah, that was the Moog. It was the Sub 37. Yeah. I think I mentioned earlier on about sort of switching off to the rest of the industry about 4 years ago, and I just unfollowed everyone and everything, and just decided, well, I'm lucky enough, and I wouldn't recommend this to anyone necessarily unless it suits you, but I was lucky enough that I had my sort of career forged to an extent where I could focus on sound design and things like that, and I had key clients that I was able to work with, and those were the things that I focused on. So I just lost interest on, I guess, what was popular at the time, and as a part of that, it wasn't a conscious thing at all, but I guess my production process completely changed, where I used to be predominantly in the box and then would come out of the box to a hardware synth to just try and add some extra texture to it. I found myself staying outside of the box and forcing limitations on my own production process. So you'll find in most of my most recent releases, it's probably 90% Moog, or I've got a couple of racks like the Proteus and bits and pieces, a few Romplers and extra bits over there. But it's 90% outboard gear, I suppose, and part of that was actually just the enjoyment level. I found when I was starting to write tracks and I was using some hardware synths, I'd get a bit of latency and maybe something would crackle every now and then, and it shouldn't. And I got to a point where I thought, you know what, I'm just going to leave that as it is. And you'll notice on a lot of my lead synths, there's a fair bit of latency at times, but I just leave it there. I don't even bother correcting it. Mm-hmm. And again, in a breakdown, I find I get so much more enjoyment recording it in manually. So if I need to open up a filter over 16, 32 bars, whatever, I'll do it by hand, and I'll just hit the record button, do it by hand, and I'll stop it when I feel it needs to be stopped, and it's all completely done by ear. There's no automation lines in my project file or anything like that. And second to that, I'll make a sound in the synth, and I'll know roughly, because of my sound design background, I'll know roughly what I'm heading for and what I want it to do. But every time I do it, it'll be slightly unique because I refuse to save those sounds. So every time I start a new track, I might think to myself, oh, I could do with that lead or that bass from that previous track. Well, I have to sit there and redesign it. So I know it's going to be slightly different every time. And I think that adds to the whole sort of human element of production, really. You know, our ears are used to hearing a drummer on drums and a guitarist on guitar, and none of them are ever perfectly in sync unless you had a band of Dave Grohls. You know, then you know, machines will never sound like humans. So I think that's kind of important to my whole production process. So the whole thing now has just led to, unconsciously, I'm just 90% outboard gear because I like the mistakes and I leave them in there.
It's definitely, I interviewed a guy last week, Stephen Kirkwood, who does trance and tech trance, and even he was saying in their field they're starting to unquantize things and just leave things and get a more of a groove and a feeling. And it's really interesting that everybody's kind of heading down this looser, more humanized feel and less rigid. And I remember making stuff back in '98, and we didn't have automation and stuff, so it was this live performance of opening filters. I loved that. It was a performance. That was as much a performance as playing, you know, the keys. It was as getting the filters going. So what's the first step? What DAW do you use? Do you open up a blank screen? Do you throw in some loops, or do you start playing on a synth and getting some leads together, or noises, or bass lines, or what's your process? You come in a morning, blank screen. What happens?
You tell me.
Coffee and cigarettes.
Yeah. I'm not sure that it's the same every time. And I don't think that's a conscious thing. I think usually I need something to inspire me, to get me into that creative process. And again, I think I'm quite lucky in that as a sound designer, I spend a lot of my time maybe working on some bass sounds, and I'll just create a bass sound where I go, oh, hang on, that would work in this key or with these notes or this sequence, and I'll just start investigating that, and before I know it, it becomes a full-blown track. Again, I might be working on some polyphonic synth and developing some chords to try and get the polyphony to harmonize or something, and I'll just drop a chord on some notes and go, oh, hang on, that's something, and just play with it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I might be doing the same with drums. In terms of my starting place, so I'm 100% Bitwig for my own productions, and I think that's very important for me now.
So did you move from Ableton or something? How did the Bitwig bit start?
So I mean, I started obviously back in the 90s and with the Atari ST, then eventually moved to Cubase when Cubase launched. Was it Cubasis Audio, which was essentially just an audio editing thing, then Cubase VST, and then so on. Then I ended up on Ableton, I think on version 4 or 5, and then when Bitwig first came about, Dom, who owns Bitwig, actually approached me saying, do you want to try it out? We're in alpha version at the moment, see what you think. So I tried it out, and I sort of thought, okay, this is good, and I wasn't convinced I was going to change to Ableton, but that kind of didn't matter. I was happy to give feedback, and then I found every now and then there was something missing in Ableton, and it was more focused on the modular side of stuff. You couldn't. I wanted to get a parameter of one device to tweak the parameter of another device, and that was something that Bitwig did from the ground up. So I just found myself sort of edging towards Bitwig then, and now I can't look back. I don't know how I did anything in any other DAW. So it's really become fundamental to what I do now. And even more so now they've launched version 2, because they've taken the whole modular system to a whole new level. And the fact that I can now in fact, I was doing something the other day. I was working on a track, and I ended up, for some reason, I was reading a forum post, and someone was talking about dynamics and how do you remove the compression from a track that's already been compressed. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, there obviously isn't a way you can really sort of expand the dynamics of a track that's been mastered if you've only got the WAV. And then I thought, well, how do you increase the dynamics of a room? And one thing led to another, and I ended up thinking, if you imagine yourself stood in a church where there's a lot of reverb, part of the dynamics of that huge room is that the louder I shout in a church, not that I'd recommend that, the longer the tail of the reverb and the more reverb there is. And then I started thinking about, okay, so can we increase dynamics of a synth? If a synth is hitting an RMS of -3 dB because it's a square wave or whatever, then can we, without changing the velocity necessarily, or by playing with the velocity, can we change the dynamics by using reverb? So I then ended up building a little reverb system inside Bitwig where I set up an envelope follower based on amplitude that changes the wet dry elements of a reverb. So the louder the synth is, the heavier the reverb, and the softer the synth is, the quieter the reverb, and it just suddenly makes things sound like they're in a small or a changing room, and it seems to really sort of change everything. And it's just such a, I'm sure if I get to finish these tracks and when they come out in, say, a year's time, I'm sure nobody's going to listen to that and go, oh, that synth sounds like it's in a differing room. But it's just for my own personal pleasure.
Exactly. You can sit back and just go, oh, I know what's going on here, smugly, while people go, yeah, it's a nice lead sound. Yeah, I really dig it. It's cool.
That's it.
So use Bitwig, use a lot of Moog outboard. What would be your favourite in the box synth then?
It might be biased because I helped work on it, but Xfer Serum, I genuinely think takes synthesis to a new level at the moment. The wave tables are incredible. I know Steve spent a long time trying to get those wavetables right. And I ended up trying to do some with him, just by recording random sounds and then converting them into wavetables. So on the geeky side of Serum, it's an incredible piece of kit. But actually, just as a general consumer using something every day, there's really not much that Serum can't do. And I find that, having all the LFOs and everything so visual in there makes a huge difference. Being able to see the envelopes move up with everything. I think that really starts to change things. And that's something that I think you'd find incredibly difficult to get across in hardware. In fact, I'm not convinced you could do it with hardware unless it was digital.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It certainly seems to have become this sort of all-round synth that everybody, it does wavetable, it does just your basic sawtooth and does those very well. Great effects, great filters and stuff. So yeah, I just wonder where the whole synthesis thing goes after that. Obviously, Anna 2 is going to come out and blow everything out of the water. You see? Yeah,
I hope so. I've heard about it, and I'm still waiting to get my copy.
Well, the beta copy should be going out very, very soon to some people. So so we'll keep you definitely in mind about that. So you are you start out of the box. You start playing with things. Do you use a lot of samples? Do you program your own things? What way do you do your drums? I'm always interested in drums. Is it samples, loops, chopped up loops, or do you have a kit built, or what way?
I don't really have any set rules. I tend to, so I use Xfer Nerve as my sampler.
Yeah.
And that's in my Bitwig template, basically. So that's something should have mentioned earlier, was my starting point. I have a template in Bitwig, and that has a couple of instances of Nerve. There's a couple of instances of various Moogs I've got in here that are all just ready to go. And I have a couple of Xfer Serum, and in fact there's an instance of Native Instruments Reactor Player in there as well. I'm a huge fan of that.
And what do you use in Reactor? Is it like Monarch or something? Is it?
I like Monarch, but I've got to be honest, I tend to go to Razor for a lot of things. I just love the whole additive sound. And I think that's part of where I like to stand in creating different sounds and something a bit different. Razor has everything for that. It's just such a bizarre beast, and even as a sound designer, I don't completely understand what it's doing half the time.
I don't think Native Instruments understand
it. No. But I mean, it's due to the nature of additive synthesis. It's processing millions of things at the same time. So I don't suppose we'll ever understand it. But that's kind of the beauty of it, really. So I'm a huge fan of Ray.
What about then effects? What sort of effects do you really like? What's reverb or delays? Are you a UAD guy, waves, or what's?
I've got to be honest, I don't really venture outside of the box with effects. I kind of feel like, don't get me wrong, when I'm doing, say, a mixdown job, I use a lot of the UAD products. If I wanted to put some reverb on vocals, I would go straight to UAD, hands down. Wouldn't even question any other.
Which one?
The RealVerb Pro.
Right.
I particularly like, but there's a few in there. In fact, I quite like the Lexicon one they have as well, depending on the kind of sound you're going for. And so this kind of ties me in with why I use things in the box when it comes to effects. So every effect has its own character, I suppose, and that's very true, and every compressor is slightly different. But when you're producing something in Bitwig, for example, and it's electronic music, and you want to compress a kick drum. Not that I use many compressors in anything ever, but if you, for example, wanted to compress a kick drum, I think if we're brutally honest, it kind of doesn't matter what compressor you're going to use, because nobody is going to listen to just a kick drum in a finished track and go, oh, I like the compressor he's used on that. You know, if you're just wanting some reverb on a lead synth, I don't think anybody is ever really going to judge you on the reverb you used on that tiny little lead hidden in a track of 70 other synths. So if I want reverb just as an effect for a lead, I'll just grab the default reverb from Bitwig and play with the dials there. You know, and the same goes for most other effects.
And if you're compressing, say, a drum bus, would you what compressor would you kind of go? What is there a compressor you think this is particularly nice on drums and punchy and really fattens them up?
Again, I don't use compressors really. If I wanted to compress a drum bus, I don't know what my go-to is. Probably some of the waves. I quite like the CLA, and I quite like the L series, and I suppose actually for a mix bus I might go down the SSL route, or in fact some of the Oxford Precision stuff. They're very nice.
Again, this is something that comes through time and time again. You know, when guys get to a certain level, they start stripping out plugins. You know, when everybody started out, it was like, oh, we can have a compressor in every channel and limiters and stuff. And then the more I talk to people, the more they go, no, I don't have anything on my kick drums. I don't have anything on my drum bus. You know, what's the point in compressing a pad? It doesn't make any sense. You know, just turn it up a little bit. Pads tend to be static unless it's humanly played with big, you know, dynamic range in it. And again, the mix bus, there's probably this misperception that once you slap all these limiters and stuff over, your mix is going to sound amazing. Where actually, fundamentally, your sound selection stuff is wrong. So once you get that right, you don't need all this crap at the end, and the less is better. Is that kind of something you're developing? Is the less is more attitude?
Absolutely, yeah. I kind of figure, you know, so when I'm producing, there's nothing in the master channel. All my tracks in Bitwig default to minus 10 dB, so there's never any peaking anyway. Yeah, genuinely, I couldn't tell you the last time I used a compressor in my own productions, whether it be on drums, synths, you name it. I think when it comes to acoustic recordings, maybe, you know, if you used a genuine piano recording or something, then okay, you might want the quieter bits to kind of match the louder bits at times, and that's when a compressor would be valuable. But in my own productions, I really just it doesn't even occur to me, to be honest. I kind of feel like if you need a compressor to make your drums sound louder, then you've probably used the wrong drum sounds in the first place. And I think you need to go back a level before your compressor and go, right, what is it in the mix that's wrong here? Because is it, for example, sometimes I can find myself, in fact quite often, I can find myself shortening a kick drum after I've written the track. I'll get to the end of the track and I'll think that kick drum just sounds a bit muddy, and it's almost like it's swamping out the rest of the track and it needs tightening up. And I think some people will resort to using a compressor to either compress everything else and get it to match that kick, or to just take away some of the release time of the kick or whatever. Whereas I think actually, no, just reshape that kick in the first place. And in fact, a big shout out to Sonic Academy's Kick 2 for that, because shortening the kick drum in that is just such a beautiful experience. It's completely changed the way I design my kick drums. Yeah, you guys nailed it, and you genuinely have. It's actually, that was one of the other things that's now in my Bitwig template, and it's just there from the start, because I know if I want a kick drum to fit the track, I can just reshape it slightly in Kick 2, and there's just no need for a compressor then.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, if I feel the attack of a kick drum, and I think it's probably kick drums people suffer with the most, especially when it comes to gluing it around or inside a bass line. And I find that rather than trying to get it to glue by compressing the kicks and bass together, you're far better off actually going back a level and going, right, let's listen to the shape of the kick drum. So if you've got an extended bass line, for example, shorten the kick, and just add a bit more punch or a bit more mid-range body to it. If you've got a big, short, snappy, attacky bass line, then you can start playing with the release time and extending your kick drum. And that kind of almost does it definitely does a much better job than any compressor ever could, really.
Yeah. No, it's definitely something that a lot of people talked about. I remember Steve Duda talking about hearing Joel's tracks in a club and talking about the length of the kick and getting this sort of this movement between bassline and kick and trying to get them to flow and again it's down to groove, and that's your foundation. If you've got that nailed, and that just, if I always, when I was making tracks, could switch everything off just to get the kick and bass, and if it just sat and rocked my world, that was it. Everything else on top was you know, fairy dust. As long as that those two elements worked together, that's where you had to get everything started. So you use a lot of Moog stuff into the box, so you send MIDI to the Moog, play filters live, and then you obviously just print it to tape and then commit it, and kind of, that's kind of old school. It's like laying down your performance and then moving on. Is that how you work?
Yeah, and I like the restrictions of it. So you know, I'll design a sound that I think suits the track, develop a melody with that sound or whatever it is I'm doing with that sound, and I'll start to just play with it. Basically, I'll play the track on, say, a 16-bar loop, and I'll just sit or stand at the synth and just play with the dials and just enjoy the moment for what it is. And I get to a point where I then start to forget, oh yeah, I'm producing a track here. And it becomes more of a selfish performance for myself, and I just enjoy the moment. And then I might turn one of the dials. It might be the release time of a stab, or it might be the filter or the resonance, or it might be the LFO, and I'll start playing around with various bits, and the sound will change. And then I might just do something where I go, oh, hang on, that's really changing everything, and that changes the groove of the track or the vibe of the track. And that's when I'll go, right, now's the time to sit down, hit record on Bitwig, and go, right, what did I do there? Start playing it, and hopefully in real time record it in. It might take 2, 3, 4 takes, but I'll get there in the end. And then once I've recorded it and I decide, right, this is the sound that's going to stay in my track, I'll switch off the Moog and go, right, that's that sound gone, never to be seen again. And I just have to work with that recording, and sometimes I find myself hearing the track back, you know, a week later, going, oh, I wish I'd done X, Y, and Z, or oh, I should have moved that filter a bit sooner or later or whatever. Tough.
Well, I think you
know, and if I am that concerned about it, I'll go back and re-record it and redesign the sound, and I have to start again. But having that restriction, actually, I find really sort of liberating and allows me to move forward, because I think, and I'm sure anyone watching this video who mixes and or masters their own tracks, which I think most people do these days, I think we can all agree that we all reach that point where we're going, right, the track's great, I'm moving on to the mix down. And then halfway through the mix down, you go, oh, what if I changed that sound? And then you go back, and then you come back to the mix down, and now you go, oh, actually, now that sounds different. And you keep going back and forth, and you never actually get your mix down finished. Whereas with this, I tend to go, oh, I wish I'd changed that filter earlier. tough. It's gone. I'm not going to spend an entire day rewriting it. So that's my limitations done, and it becomes a lot more liberating because you can just go, forget it, move forward.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You wouldn't be listening back a week later because you'd still be tweaking, and this endless tweaking is something I fall into and hate. I wish I was more restrictive and just going, that's the sound. So what's coming up for 2017? What's the rest of the year plans?
Well, so I'm in the process of getting an EP done for Mousetrap at the moment. Everything seems to be looking quite good there. There are a few collaborations I've got going on with some of the other artists there as well.
Brilliant.
And there are some other things that I can't talk about yet. Other than that, I'm really just happy doing what I'm doing. I enjoy doing the sound design thing. I was running a sound design label, Quantum Loops, and I shut that down a couple of years ago with a view to sort of rebranding and moving that forward as part of the Kane Audio studio thing. So I'll probably be doing that later this year. But I think this time I'm sort of where I was, I think, running that as quite a genre focused thing. I'm quite keen to start venturing into perhaps more creative sides of recording vintage synths and then developing new digital synths within, say, Reactor Player or Contact Player or something. So that I can start developing contact banks based on sounds that perhaps people wouldn't normally come across. So there's hopefully going to be some pretty interesting things lying ahead.
Well, look, thank you very much for joining us on Sonic Academy today. Wish you all luck with your EP. I'd definitely be looking out for it. Your track, Low Pass Friends, on the last compilation was brilliant, and I love just that sound. And I can hear your sound developing and pushing forward. I can hear Mousetrap influence and stuff. So look, I wish you all the best. We'll definitely get you a copy of Anna, and I'd love to get your sound design thoughts on that soon. So thank you very much for joining us on Sonic Academy today.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
No problem. Guys, I hope you all got something from that. Thank you, Dom, for taking time out to do that. We'll see you all very, very soon. Bye. Thanks everybody for watching, commenting, and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content, and if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.